Okay, the attendees start pouring in. Pause quiet for about 3 seconds and then start speaking. I'm gonna okay, the recording already.
Wow, that's a lot of attendees. Whoa.
So I was told not to talk, everybody, but it's too awkward not to talk. So I'm just going to say nothing that's really important as we're waiting to get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm super excited, actually, about this session. I've got my pens. I'm getting ready to take notes. Three academics and friends of mine who will be presenting. So it should be really cool.
I thought you said no presenting, man, more conversation.
More conversation. Welcome to another conversation.
Or else Dr. Hernandez would have had his PowerPoint ready.
Right.
That's right.
Right. Because that's how they get you. They be like, oh no, this is going to be a free flowing talk at a job talk. And you don't know, it's just going to make you as comfortable as possible. Then you find out the guy after you just brought in a darn slideshow, with even the overhead. It's like, dang, okay.
Nobody else brought in their PowerPoint?
Exactly.
I brought in my PowerPoint and my book, just published. I thought that's what we were doing.
Okay, everybody. I'm getting the go-ahead from our tech folks, Jean-Louis and Mimi. So let's go ahead and get started. Thanks again for joining us for the Pillars of the Community Political Education series around policing in the United States. Today, we're getting right to the point and dealing straight up with the history of policing in the United States and kind of where the roots are and what it's all about. In the time of Facebook and Instagram and memes, I think there's a lot of different conversations that happen about policing and where it comes from. And so we wanted to invite some scholars, some historians and sociologists to kind of talk about how their research kind of can give us insight into the times that we're living in. So without much further ado, as always, our political education classes don't come from any particular ideological slant except for shit is complex. And so what we're looking for really isn't right and wrong answers, but an opportunity really to be able to think critically, to understand the context of different issues that are happening. And I think we have three kind of amazing people here today. So Dr. Roberto Hernandez is a Chicano, Chicanx studies professor at San Diego State University. Dr. Sandra Harvey is a sociology professor in the African American Studies program at the UC Irvine. And then we have our very own Dr. Odom, a close friend of mine, long-term Pillars of the Community, community activist, amazing intellectual, and one of my good friends. So I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves, and then we'll let the questions begin. So Dr. Odom, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself, a little bit about your background and what brings you to this conversation today, and then we'll have Dr. Roberto and Dr. Sandra introduce themselves as well. So Dr. Odom.
All right, hey, some people know me as Michael, some people know me as Matsemela, Odom. Both are my given names. I teach locally at the within the San Diego Community College District, as well as other colleges and universities locally. My research that we'll be talking about today goes back pretty far, all the way to the early 2000s, in which since I was undergrad, looking at policing and the history of Black people, African-American people, whatever term we're using today, in the US and other places. In 2017, I finished my dissertation at the University of California, San Diego, which looked at some of these themes as well. It was called From Southern California to Southern Africa. Most recently, Professor Widener and I co-published an article which looks at some of these issues as well, which we'll bring up today. So yeah, when I returned to San Diego in 2011, a little bit after that, I got involved with Pillars. So I've been affiliated with Pillars for a while now, almost a decade, almost actually. Lastly, I'm involved with the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, where I'm the head of a campaign called Africans Charged Genocide. So salute to Chairman Omali Yeshitela, President Kalambi and Annette, and we'll talk about some of that stuff today. But those are the things that bring me here. It was very clear when I was a youth that there was a line drawn, right? It was on a colonial line between Black people of the community and the police, no matter who sat inside the police cars that patrolled our community. And hopefully that's some of the perspective I'll bring today.
Okay, so I guess I'll go next. So I'm Roberto Hernandez, and I grew up right in San Isidro, probably about 10 blocks from the border wall. And I always usually begin by mentioning that because for me, you know, growing up, it was always an issue, not just of dealing with constant police harassment, but also border patrol harassment. And even more specifically, and vigilante border, people trying to be on the border. So more specifically, in 1984, there was a massacre at McDonald's that targeted Mexicanos. One guy killed 21 people. Some of those kids that were killed there were my neighbors, my childhood friends. So from a very young age, you know, with the border patrol on the one hand, civilian terrorists on the others, right? The type of questioning that came up for me as a kid was like, you know, why are they hunting us down? And as Michael mentioned, right, the lines were drawn in the 80s when it came to border patrol. It was a different kind of line. It was mostly white, and then San Isidro, predominantly Raza community. So it was a very clear line drawn there as well. Although now they have a good affirmative action program, over 50% of border patrol are now Latino. That's a whole other story. But, you know, out of that kind of line of questioning, then, you know, I started thinking about not just police, but also border patrol as different forms of policing. And in many ways, you know, it ultimately does link back to the similar colonial question that I was then able to kind of further a little bit in my own research a lot about colonial and border violence. And then at some point, I was a visiting grad student in Santa Barbara. And I was in the Center for Black Studies Research brought in by Clyde Woods there, who I inherited a course that he used to teach called From Plantations to Prisons. So he first asked me to cover that course, and it already kind of lined up with some of the colonial border violence stuff, but it just took a more focused dimension. And now at San Diego State, you know, since Santa Barbara's on a quarter, it was 10 weeks. State is 16 weeks. So I continue to teach that course that I first got from Clyde, but now it's from haciendas and plantations to prisons and immigration detention centers and so on, right? So the historical links between different forms of captivity and labor of both Black and Indigenous brown bodies through to the present. So that's part of what I bring, I guess you could say, to this conversation. And behind me, you see Centro Cultural La Raza, space that is very dear to my heart, that I work closely with, that just reopened today, actually. And we're starting our year-long 50th anniversary for the Centro. So we'll be having a lot of similar activities like this as well. So look forward to those.
Okay, thank you for that, and thanks for the invitation. My name is Sandra Harvey. I'm actually from Oakland, California, which one has to always say when one is from Oakland, land of Wheateen. I'm now currently in Irvine. I teach at UC Irvine in African American Studies. It's the land of the Hachiman and the Tongva people. So I just want to put that out at the beginning, because I think that when we're talking about the histories of policing, we're also talking about the histories of enslavement and settler colonialism and colonialism more broadly. And so that is sort of, you know, the the sort of framework from which I am interested in looking at questions around policing and how it materializes in our life. I have a master's degree in sociology from the Universidad de Chile. So I spent about 5 years or so in Santiago before I came back to the United States. And so, you know, my general interest is in the question of policing, not solely from the perspective of sort of the state apparatus of policing, although that is incredibly important to me, but also the way in which policing occurs beyond the simple sort of official state apparatus. So one of the questions that I look at in my work is, what are the ways that we are doing the work of the state around surveillance and policing in our own lives, in our own homes, in our own communities, organizations, in the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. So my research looks at questions of the surveillance of Blackness and Black people in the United States from the 17th century on. I'm not a historian, I'm a political theorist, so that means that I'm more drawn to sort of the big picture questions. And so I think it'll be a really good mix of talking about, you know, what has happened and talking about the sort of the effects of what has happened on who we think we are and where we think we are as well. So I'll just leave it very broadly like that.
Fantastic. Thank all three of you for your introductions, and thank you all for being a part of our series. We want to talk a little bit, I think, to start about the history of policing in the United States, its racialization, and how that question of policing has become and became central to the life experiences of people of African descent in the New World in the United States. So Dr. Odom, Michael, if you want to begin us there, maybe with 7-10 minutes, just to give us an overview, set the stage for us about the relationship between race and policing in the long run.
All right, yeah, thank you. And I'm happy that everyone here raised the colonial question because, you know, the colonial question is absolutely central to us to get to where we're going, because without the colonial question, you know, things like defund the police or police abolition don't really mean anything. They just become slogans that are used to usher in some larger form of say, reforms that eventually just lead to newer forms of abuse that at the end of the day are more palatable to American liberal public conscience and stuff like that. So I think that's why we have to do that. I mean, I think that sort of the colonial question is essential too, because it sort of gets us out of this mind of, say, cops and robbers, which we are generally stuck with when we think about policing, good guys, bad guys, or sometimes it takes a bad guy to catch a bad guy type stuff. Because then it sort of asks you to ask questions not about the guns in the hands of the people who get killed by the police, but the guns in the hands of the police, right? The colonial question allows for us to ask, okay, well, if in the United States, as Omar Yeshchela said recently, in the United States, they call the Marines the police, but in Vietnam, they call it the police, our police officers, the Marines, right? So if we take that sort of question, then it's never sort of a question of like, rules of procedure. It's why were the Marines in Vietnam, not whether a guy had a bomb or whether a guy had a gun or something like that. And like I said, it's that ground through which I think we have to start. So, I mean, my language clearly does start with 1704 explicitly, because that was the year that the first slave patrol was created. It was in response to a larger legalization or legal apparatus that was created around slavery in the Chesapeake region, as well as the Carolinas and stuff like that. It was an interesting point. It was sort of before some of the greater slave rebellions of the early 18th century, but it was in the same mode and the same period of the slave rebellions that was taking place throughout Latin America and the Caribbean at that time. And it's very clear that the people in the Carolinas and Virginia at that time were conscious of that. They were more conscious actually of the events taking place in the Caribbean than they would have been of events taking place in Massachusetts or something like that. I think sort of that little 13 colonies map make us think that like all the colonies were together. Well, it was a whole world of colonies, right? And it was a political and material connection. So the colonies of the sort of the southeastern seaboard were clearly connected to what was taking place in Latin America and Central America and in the Caribbean. And this was the moment of the Maroons. This was the moment of large-scale rebellion, and the people knew that they didn't want to that to happen here. One good document that's out there that sort of helps us understand this moment, but it's so sad that it's not understood as the important work of fiction that it is the Willie Lynch letter, right? The Willie Lynch letter is not a real letter, but if you take it as a piece of popular fiction, which lets us understand the early 18th century, then we can understand in this fictional letter, the Willie Lynch letter, a very real historical moment that's happening in which this sort of policing apparatus is being created in what is now the US. But, you know, shout out to Roberto, it didn't come out of nowhere, right? I mean, we can go all the way back to what's called the New Laws of the Spanish Empire, I want to say the 1550s, which is dictating, you know, how Indians, how Africans can be treated and things like that. So hopefully, I know Roberto is going to talk a little bit more about that, but I did want to begin with that moment because I remember even when I first started teaching and even activism, you know, we'd say like, you know, the police are the slave catchers, the police are the slave catchers. And then, but like, you know, even in my mind, I'd be like, yeah, that's a real good analogy. Until I hit the point where I'm like, oh shit, like the police really are the slave catchers. Like, it's not really it's you guys that are listening, you got to understand this is not like really, it's not hyperbole, right? It's not metaphor. In 1704, you get the very first police, the very first slave catchers. The slave catchers, they have oaths that they take. It's a civic pride. It's a civic duty. The other thing we have to understand about the police, and this is long before the actual police, but the slave catchers, is that it's a way, slave catching becomes a way through which the white working class finds unity with the white upper class, right? So so the policing first of enslaved Africans, and then as we begin to see populations of free blacks grow, free quote unquote blacks grow in the northern cities, that's when we're going to see the creation of the police departments in the north. It's not just about white workers in the north and black workers in the south. It's not until the 1830s that we see the first police departments in Boston, New York, Philadelphia. Those are the largest police departments. Those are the largest places in which you got black populations at that time in the north. And then white workers, as David Rediker and others have already said, are embracing police work as a way to gain some distance between them and Africans. So we see policing at every single moment that colonialism and capitalism's relationship to the African working class is shifting. We see policing shifting in the history of the U.S. And internationally. So another historian we can look to is Khalil Gibran Muhammad's book, The Condemnation of Blackness, which allows us to understand then that, say, the next big shift in policing is going to take place during the Great Migration. And then after that, we can think about, say, the vagrancy laws and stuff like that, which is policing people in the 1930s. Well, from the slave period, but then we think about the Scottsboro case. The Scottsboro case isn't just about, you know, this idea of rape. It's also about this idea of black vagrancy and mobility. So the police are an institution that's going to be used to police and to stop Black mobility, socially Black physical mobility, exactly, but also social mobility at this time as well. So in that sense, we understand the police as a form of physical mobility. There's three dates I would give you. Then 1704, that's creation of the first slave patrol. 1838, that's the creation of the first police department. In 1924 is the creation of the border patrol. I know that that's going to be said, but Kelly Lido Hernandez in her book Migra writes, there is, in other words, no quote unquote beyond Black and white in the story of U.S. immigration control. It is precisely the Black and white dimensions of policing Mexicans for unsanctioned migration that clarify how U.S. immigration and law enforcement evolved as a story of race in the U.S. So we think about, what did the slave catchers do? They captured Africans, put them back on the slave plantations. The earliest border patrol wasn't just about keeping people out, it's about keeping people on farms. So if you jump from the farm to the city, the border patrol go to the city, do a raid, and take you back to the farms, right? So it's about the control of Black and brown labor. And then, to the present. I've been talking, it's pretty much my time, so I'll just jump all the way to the present and say, well, many of the issues that we have right now have to do with sort of the lack of the way in which people understand police reforms. In the 1970s, the weapons, there's a guy named Michael Zinzin. He did a lot of research on this in LA. Zinzin really, as an activist, understood that sort of the use of the weapons was telling a story of policing and stuff like that. And just go back to the movies. In the 1970s, it was a pistol, which was a revolver, and a stick, right? So that's when the concern was of the chokeholds and things like that, and the accidental shootings. But we get these reforms. The reforms is sort of non-lethal weapons, and you see all of them on the belts. But even with all of these quote unquote non-lethal weapons that were part of the reforms that people were pushing, the police murders go up. Right. So I think that's a part of another thing. And last thing I'll say is there's the direct connection between the guns on the streets and the guns that the police use. That's why, because people always say, well, why do they have guns? Because the police have guns. That's why they have guns, because the police have guns. So that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Odom. You have a lot of information to share. I know the historian extraordinaire, so thank you. I wanted to ask just a question about, how has policing, impacted different groups of people here in the U.S. And so I'll direct this to you, Dr. Hernandez. What has been the role of policing within the, Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx community, a Mexican community with police?
Yeah, so as with Michael, I also like to properly historicize things, right? And so I'll come at this from a slightly different genealogy of sorts, right? If right now, as we're talking about defunding police or abolish the police or what have you, right? Those of us who've been trying to broaden the conversation have been insisting that, policing is not just getting rid of the police, it's not just getting rid of prisons, but we need to look at the whole structure of not just a prison industrial complex, but even more broadly, militarism, Second Amendment, this whole attitude about guns, right? Or what Slotkin famously called gunfighter nation, right? That violence is at the root of the history of this nation. And if we say that, then, and I appreciate that Michael took us back to 1704, the nation technically begins then, but, the tendency in Western social sciences to then discount everything else as not relevant, right? Well, that was a colonial period. Now it's a national period. Everything else doesn't matter. But no, quite the contrary. The links between, I would say, even police, despite the formal police department not coming into fruition till 1838, when we look at this history from the West, right, where there's a tendency to look at U.S. history in very black and white terms, and in the East, and then eventually makes its way over here, but looking at it from the perspective of peoples on these territories, where you have this advancing army coming from the East to West, you get a very different picture. The other very common slogan that is, or not slogan, but metaphor, if you will, that Michael also pointed out is not really a metaphor for police, is occupying army. So from the perspectives of, be it the Lakotas right now who are defending Black Hills as we speak, Trump from going into the Black Mountain or Mount Rushmore, carrying on through to the Montana, to the Cheyennes, Apaches, Diné's, all the way up here to where I'm at in Kumeyaay territory, right? For us, for Native people, it's always been an occupying army, right? So the advanced lines or the supposed frontiersmen, right? I see the police as the institutionalization of these frontiersmen, right, of frontier violence now, for lack of a better term, secularized into a police department or institutionalized into police forces. So the history then of anti-Indian violence, right, anti-Indigenous violence in the quote unquote frontier is what I think kind of becomes this other major anchor, right? On the one hand, you have the history of kidnapping, transporting, and enslaving peoples from Africa, and on the other hand, you have colonialism, settler colonialism. I use a different lens in settler colonialism. I speak more of coloniality just because I'm more grounded in the Spanish and Portuguese colonial experience, and I think there's some important differences there. But nevertheless, right, it's through these quite literally occupying armies that are according to Frederick Jackson Turner, the advanced line or the line between civilization and savagery that becomes about establishing a particular order. So when we talk about police today as law and order, that it assumes the order was already there. No, the very process of establishing the order was the frontier violence, right? Joseph Nevins, in a book on the Operation Gatekeeper on the U.S.-Mexico border, makes this distinction that comes, I believe, if I remember correctly, from Michael Mann, between despotic power and infrastructural power, right? And so the despotic power being that initial anything goes Wild West type shit that allowed for outright violence, scalping, killing, slaughtering, what have you, right? And infrastructural power being once that type of raw violence was no longer as explicit or necessary because you have people under your order, under your control, right? And so for me, thinking about the policing of now even Mexicano, Latinx communities, rather than thinking in terms of immigration, and yes, the Border Patrol 1924, but for me, what we see as a policing of Mexican Latinx bodies is really a continuation of anti-Indigenous violence, right? That can now be spoken of in terms of immigration only because of the normalization of national territorial boundaries of borders, nation state borders, right? It's the borders that then turns us into Mexicans rather than, say, Huirarica, which is where my peoples come from on my mother's side, Mom on my father's side. We've become Mexicanized, and now we could be called migrants, immigrants, right, which naturalizes a border. As opposed to us coming from our various peoples. So when we look at, we talk about the tendencies to say, Black Lives Matter, Brown Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, But even there, I think it gets messy because when we're talking about indigenous lives and brown lives, you know, yes, there's some subtle nuances in the populations, but ultimately both, I think, are rooted in this anti-indigenous violence that is about establishing an order of pacification, right? The idea of pacifying the frontier and creating that very same order that is then to be protected in the name of quote unquote law and order. So even, you know, now forwarding more into this last century, if you will, Border Patrol definitely a big part of formalizing violence and shifting the lens to no longer think of us as Indian, but as migrants, right? Which adds yet another layer of obfuscation to the whole thing. And allows for us to then, you know, talk about, say, the rights of US citizens. Well, what about those that are non-citizens? What about undocumented? Because of the border, we already even like lessen our lens to just think of very specific peoples with already categories that are themselves relatively recent. But that nevertheless, that violence goes back further, which for me is part of, you know, to mention Brother Huey P. Newton, right? Part of why the Panthers would say you got to shoot that pig in your head. And the pig in your head is not just, and I can't wait to hear Dr. Harvey on you know, how we police each other, right? But the pig in your head is not just that, but it's also, you know, the pig in your head that tells you that that border matters. That tells you that, you know, those on the other side of the border are different people, right? I mean, to me, I refer to it more as an epistemic and cartographic prison of modernity coloniality that naturalizes these different national identities and then legitimizes, you know, different forms of violence from there. But as early as 1972, I do want to mention, just to close out this part, a book by Armando Morales called Ando Sangrando, which translates to I Am Bleeding. And this was 1972, a study of police violence in Mexican American communities. But again, if we just think in terms of Mexican American or Latinx, we're already doing a disservice even to ourselves because we're naturalizing those borders and we're losing sight that this is that other anchor of anti-indigenous violence that alongside anti-Black violence has always been at the root of this nation.
That's really fantastic and helpful
Yeah.
addendum and broadening and additionality to what I think Michael said. And we're starting to see folks, some of these points y'all are raising resonating with folks. I do want to use that dual kind of opportunity to offer a dual segue as we asked Dr. Harvey to give her thoughts, both because Roberto, you mentioned this issue of the conquest and the genocide and the repression of indigenous people and the erasure of indigeneity as the basis for understanding belonging here, and the kind of moment from which other things flow. And I know that's an area of Dr. Harvey's expertise, but also you mentioned, as Huey said, the pig inside. And I think that this question of surveillance is such a fascinating one. Right before the call began, I saw an email that said, you know, all of a sudden now on your iPhone, unbeknownst to you, you can sign up to be tracked in case you've been exposed to someone who's COVID positive. So there seems to be a capacity for us to be surveilled, really even knowing, I suppose. So I don't know if either of those are places that you want to touch on, Dr. Harvey, but we'll pass to you to give us a little bit of a sense of how the process of surveillance, monitoring, watching fits into the larger piece of the whole.
Yeah, so much has been said, and I think that when we pull up the idea of surveillance, we can sort of start to see the ways that policing happens, not just at the police station or from the police car, but from the pig in your head. What is the separation, or where is the line between where the police ends and the people starts? And I think that line has been constructed in such a way through, you know, various sort of colonial contexts that creates what we understand the people to actually mean, right? And that changes. But I think that what we assume Black to be, or what we assume Blackness to be, and what we assume Indigenous to be, or what we assume indigeneity to be, are really core sort of narratives that feed into all of our sort of fantasies of what the people actually means. So to give an example, you know, from the 17th century, as you know, European colonial forces are starting off, you know, their project in the so-called New World, and taking the example of Virginia colony, we have a call from the very beginning from colonizers to participate in the surveillance of what they have distinguished in any way to be understood as a threat to property. And in that call to defend and surveil against the threat to property, the idea of property itself comes into play. And then who can own property comes into play. And these are really key ideas for what we understand the people to mean. So for example, at 1640s, we have the very first pass laws, right? And pass laws are important sort of regimens of surveillance that we can see in most Anglo-colonial societies, from what is currently known as the United States to South Africa to Canada to Rhodesia before it became Zimbabwe, right? And that is the requirement to threats to property, and the colonial project hold passes that would allow them to move around freely in the lands in which they existed. So in 1640, we already have a requirement that indentured servants hold passes, which is a really interesting thing because indentured servants are what we consider white folks today, right? And so why is it that we start with this? And partly it's because we have a propertied class of people who are holding the rights to the debt of the indentured servants as they have come into the so-called New World and Virginia colony. And so what these property class of individuals are afraid of is that indentured servants are going to hop on a ship or run out on their debt and start their lives anew in another place. Soon after that, a couple of years after that, we have a law for Native peoples in this area to hold passes to regulate the movement of Native peoples on their own land, so that they are not allowed to cross into plantations or other sort of colonial private property in order to do their hunting, their trading, or even their mixing with other colonized subjects, such as the captive Africans who are present in colonial Virginia as well. And so then later on, enslaved Africans are required to hold passes in order to move anywhere outside of their owners' property or delineated, boundaried, territorialized property, right? And so we've got a moment in which the movement of colonized people and indebted people is regulated through the laws of holding the pass here. As indentured servitude begins to diminish and transatlantic slave trade begins to grow, it is mostly captive Africans along with indigenous people on reservations who are required to hold passes. And then we start to see a move from the pass itself as a bureaucratic document that would determine whether or not you are legally allowed to be in a certain place, to the skin of Black people as already marked as illegal, fugitive, to be questioned or not trusted from the moment. The past itself then is transferred to the body in what Frantz Fanon would later call epidermalization, right? So these laws, another sort of important thing to add to this is that white folks who were even in the propertied class didn't necessarily immediately volunteer to be engaged in the surveillance of other people's property. They had to be called by the colonial bureaucratic government in order to do so. So we see, for example, in 1815 in Louisiana, the requirement that the Louisiana state legislature passed that required the parish judges to enforce the laws around surveillance, that required for one patroller to be assigned to each group of 30 enslaved peoples in the parish, right? And that as a person with the duty to surveil suspected Black fugitives, if you failed to engage in that duty, you might also see punishment from the state. And so we can see the ways in which this isn't to say that people were abolitionists in this moment, right? It is to say that the interest in propertied class and a colonial class and a slave master class, slave owning class, was one that was encouraged bureaucratically through colonial bureaucratization. Now, what is understood to be sort of part of that class in the United States has translated because of epidermalization and anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenousness to the white skin or the almost white skin. This sort of thing translates and emerges in different states that also have dealt with colonialism in various ways, to also be one that identifies indigeneity and Blackness as sort of that which is outside of what should be included into the state and the people. So we can see, for example, on the border between the United States and Mexico, large groups of Haitian migrants who are, one, not allowed into the United States or disappeared by Border Patrol in the United States, but also sort of under anti-Black attacks within Baja California and within the state of Mexico. This is the same for Black Mexicans in Costa Chica and Guerrero, in Oaxaca, who are required to, for example, sing the Mexican national anthem as a way of proving their Mexicanness, as a way of sort of automatically assuming that one is not of the nation because of the ways in which Blackness serves as sort of an epidermal signifier for fugitive that needs to be surveilled. So maybe I'll stop there and we can continue the conversation sort of all together.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Harvey, for that, the historical context. Again, I think that's what we appreciate, about this conversation, right? Where we've come from. And so also Dr. Odom and Dr. Hernandez giving that context for us. So, I mean, in thinking historically first, has there always, and this is for anyone on the panel, right? Has there always been police, right? And what does history tell us, really about the role of police in our communities? Dr. Odom?
All right, so I mean, that's because I did some thinking. I said, okay, well, when was the first sheriff in the U.S., right? So the first sheriff is actually created around that same time, the mid 1600s in Virginia, right? To protect the shire. But the sheriff, I was thinking about that because one of these questions that we have about sheriffs. So, but the sheriff's function, I would guess, changes eventually with the creation of modern policing, and things like that. But they did have, like I said, the state power to deputize. I guess the reason why I say that is because, I mean, no matter what year we put in the 1640s, the 1500s, 1704, something like that, this is as much a historical question as it is a political question, right? It's a political question because the question is, can we return to a moment in which the police did not exist as we know them right now? Because on my Facebook page, it said, hey, it basically said, look, the police are a little bit over 200 years old in their modern function in the US. People have lived in cities for 5,000 years. So then people want to be like, well, actually, what about the vigiles in ancient Rome? But I don't live in no effing ancient Rome. I live in the United States where the police are a little over 200 years old, right? So like I said, it's a political question in the sense that, you know, can we return? Like what are we struggling for? And a grander political economic question, because, you know, instead of just sort of being some, you know, History Channel episode, the question is, what's the relationship of parasitic capitalistic colonialism with the working class, non-white working class? That's the premier question, right? Which we're talking about here, because that's going to overdetermine the function of the police. Even when the police is shooting down a white person, it's overdetermined, as Dr. Harvey said, by this history of police with non-white bodies, primarily Black and indigenous bodies, whether those indigenous bodies, regardless of which side of the imperial line that we call the border, those indigenous bodies are from, right? Like that's the question. So in that question, no, right? They didn't always exist, and they emerged for the exact same reasons that we talked about before. It's the control of African indigenous labor and the expansion of the rights and power of the white settler colonial nation. And I don't want to be the reductive thing. I do want to underscore the fact that there's a different relationship with capitalism that non-white working class people have than the white working class, right? We see the police emerging as a negotiation between the white upper class and the white working class. That's the meaning of the police unions, right? In terms of, you know, that's the emergence of these police associations, 1918 or something like that, when they first were created as a part of the AFL-CIO, as AFL at the same time that the AFL didn't allow Black workers in. So I just think that's important.
Thank you, Dr. Odom. Dr. Harvey or Hernandez, did you want to add on to that?
Well, okay, I'll go ahead and I mean, I guess I'll just say that I think part of what perhaps, you know, at the risk of moving the conversation in a different direction, but I think, you know, we need to have a broader conversation to understand policing. Because if you're asking, was there ever a time when there wasn't policing? I think part of what all three of us are at some level getting at, I don't want to overspeak here, but I feel that the dividing line between civilian and state itself is somewhat blurred. And we tend to think that there is this clear-cut divide. But I think when it comes to the question of, you know, non-property white civilians being called upon to help protect property and bodies, right, and enslaved bodies, that this is where civilians get pulled into that function, right? Sometimes they do it willingly as vigilantes and the like, but other times they're called upon, and this is that contract that a white working class even has with white upper class. But I think where I don't know if it's a question of a difference with Michael, but maybe something I would want to explore a little bit further, is that we have this tendency in Western society more broadly to always focus on change. Like I myself am guilty of it. I was once a fellow at the Institute for the Study of Social Change, right? But the tendency is like everything is always constantly changing. The only constant is change. So we're always looking to the next thing. And so even to talk about modern policing as opposed to pre-modern policing, right? Is like, if we focus so much solely on change, then we lose sight of the continuities that persist despite change, right? That's not to say nothing ever changes. I'd be foolish to say nothing ever changes. We've gone through various transformations from these frontiersmen to the slave patrols to the modern police, but what has not changed is the underlying racial logic and colonial racial logic that underpins it. So on the one hand, right, if we're talking about there is a colonial question that, yes, is tied to parasitic capitalism, but I would still highlight the colonial as something very particular that's not reducible to capitalism. Then what we see despite these transformations is that racial colonial logic that continues to inform the various permutations of these policing forces, whatever we want to call them, be they prison guards now, border patrol. One that behooves me that I haven't mentioned is the Texas Rangers, right? That predate the border patrol and were just as violent as any, if not more so than any modern day police force, right? So I don't want us to lose sight of those transformations. Yes, we live in modern US now, but we're still dealing with this racial colonial logic. And unless we think of it in those terms, we run the risk of just saying, let's deal with what the problem is now, US moving forward, right? So it raises questions of how we conceive of time, how we conceive of the relationship between modernity and colonialism, modernity, coloniality. Like I, for one, see them as two sides of the same coin, right? But the tendency is to say it was colonialism and now it's modern, right? And so I think there's all these other underlying premises and assumptions that we work from, that unless we start peeling back the layers of all those premises, we might be both talking about abolition, decolonization, but we might still be talking past each other if we're not getting down to what are the premises we're departing from.
Can I just say real quick, like I'm just say that the point that I'm trying to make in the political question is, and this was raised in Pillars years ago when we were having a question about gender oppression. And some people will say, well, there's always been gender oppression. Well, if there's always been the problem that you're trying to struggle against, then why are you trying to struggle against? Like, there's always been gravity, right? You know, that's not going to change without some sort of drastic change in how the universe works, right? No matter what you try to do to struggle against it, unless you're not going to beat it, right? So that's what when I'm raising it as a political question for people on the ground. I mean, because if we say it's a colonial question, then we can mark a colonial moment, right? Whether you mark that colonial moment 1492 or in the 1440s with the Portuguese in Africa, we can mark a colonial moment through which the relationship of the people of Europe and the people of the world begins to shift, right?
Yeah, I think that it's really important, and to say colonial moment and colonial processes that continue into the present, which I'm sure you would agree with me in saying, right? And so to say, has there always been policing? No, policing is a regime of control and surveillance and containment and enslavement of a colonial occupier and an imperial occupier, and it's not all encompassing, right? So if we're thinking about what are folks doing on the ground, well, Black and Indigenous folks and people of color have exceeded or live in excess of the colonial sort of policing apparatus, and we can think about all the ways in which we develop ideas of justice and accountability and care within our communities that can't be reduced to policing, right? And at the same time, part of the work that we're doing is thinking about how are we doing the work of the state within our own homes. So if we're thinking about, for example, gender with regard to policing and coloniality, we can see the ways in which it is policing and the prison, as well as sort of convict leasing programs that have a heavy hand in constructing what it means to be, for example, a proper white man, a proper white woman, what is feminine, what sort of roles do each of those genders play within sort of upholding the nation, and also the multiple ways in which Black peoples, Indigenous peoples, other people, colonized peoples will never sort of live up to those standards or present as a threat to those standards. And so I think that that we can't sort of, and this is what Dr. Odom, I understood you to say, right? Policing is not gravity. It's not sort of, it doesn't sort of exist as a law of nature, right? It is a historical process that that had beginnings, that continues, and that has been and continues to and needs to continue to be upended. And taking Dr. Hernandez's point, right, that this process, because policing is a colonial apparatus, must be a process that is both decolonizing and sort of a politics of abolition. And if it isn't, then what we end up doing is sort of reifying and reapplying colonial and slave logics and logics of enslavement into sort of our new ideas for what a community might look like.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, Dr. Harvey. Thank you, for breaking that down. So I have just one more question. I guess it's a little in line with what you're talking about right now, but like, do you see, or is there any relationship to, early police surveillance and gang documentation?
I mean, I personally would draw sort of similarities. For example, the requirement of, show me a pass, show me your pass. And that every white person had the right, no, the duty to request that an African, someone with Black skin, or an Indigenous person show a pass in order to prove that they have a right to be where they are on the earth, sounds a whole lot like, for example, stop and frisk at the level of the state. But it also sounds like all of the multiple sort of anecdotal stories we have been told, we've told or we've seen on the internet around, prove to me that you live here, right? Prove to me that you belong in this swimming pool. Prove to me that you are allowed to ride in this car and that this car belongs to you. Prove to me that you are allowed to set foot in this nation. And if you don't, I have the right to make sure that you are disappeared, whether that be in a detention center or off of the face of the earth.
Oh yeah, thank you. I'm listening and I'm hearing a lot of parallels between a lot of these videos we're seeing about quote unquote Karens out there also,
right,
policing.
And George Zimmerman's.
Zimmerman.
Yes.
I was thinking Zimmerman.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one.
Absolutely.
Did you want to jump in on that, Roberto, before I give a comment?
Yeah. I'll just say one thing that, I mean, I think all of what we've been discussing perhaps necessitates a shifting of a question, and in the sense that, we go to the famous slogan, police are here to protect and serve. Well, I'm sorry, they're not here to protect and serve us. We know that for a fact. History tells us that dark bodies, Black, brown, Indigenous bodies have always been targets or prey or hunted, quite literally, right? So what then does it mean to be hunted? What then does it mean to be prey? What then does it mean to be active targets? And if that, again, not that it's like gravity, I think it is historical, but that's what I mean by the underlying colonial logic. If that is the logic that carries through despite the transformations in the forms of policing, then, you know, we need to be asking different types of questions in terms of us, you know, not just police reform or even defunding, but rather what does it mean to be prey? What does it mean to be hunted, right? And if we recognize that that is in fact the current presiding order, then what are we going to do about that?
I really like that question. I mean, it really gets at what Pillars it does and what Pillars was founded to do. I think that's important. I'd also direct people to go to what's called Black is Back Coalition website. Look up Principle, I want to say 3, which is on Black community control of police, which gives a very solid definition of I think, a Black radical, Black progressive position on a way to sort of reversing the relationship between the African community and the police. It's important to note that it's a sort of, so I think this idea of I think Roberto was talking about an occupying army, which is exactly correct, right? An occupying army through which conscription of sort of everyday people takes place, and then through that they gain profit. I mean, that's exactly how the colonization of the Americas took place from the day that the Spanish arrived. I mean, there's this one good book, you can debate whether it's good or not, one useful book called 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest by Matthew Restall. And one of the points he does make is this myth of the King's Army, but it was everyday people, right? Who, and even the people who led it, none of them were nobility. They at best were sort of like, we understand them as petty bourgeois merchants nowadays, moving to other places so that sort of they can gain status by the exploitation of other people. That's a little bit off, but I do want to say that one thing I want to say is that the gangs, yeah, I think the gang question is crucial because it then changes this question of legality, people to exist, and justice, right? So it shifts. If in the colonial question we see the police as occupying armies, right? The gang question then flips it, and then sort of the gangs become the sort of bad guys, and the police become the necessary forces and stuff like that. And if you look at that question, that logic that informs policing in our neighborhoods, you know, it goes all the way back to sort of, the creation of the slave patrols to stop, roving bands of Africans or Maroons or whoever else is indigenous people living on the outside of colonial law or something like that. So I think that that is central because, Frantz Fanon's been brought up again, but, if we understand then gangs as people if we take a Black radical understanding of what gangs are, which is workers, African workers living outside of the relationship, the normal relationship that the ruling class have with the African working class, the Panthers understood that, Fanon understood that, other activists understand that. Then it's at that moment that we understand what's really going on, right? It's really a policing, a really sort of people who have chosen to sort of live outside of that norm or something like that. And then eventually to get the other colonized to fear the people who are choosing to live outside of that norm more than they fear the people who sort of relentlessly kill those people or something like that, right? That's part of it. I mean, just want to say rest in peace, Leo Ibarra Hurtado here in San Diego, killed last Saturday by the police. It was interesting. They say his family's from Puerto Rico. He but the police called him quote unquote Hispanic. And I said for 500 years, Puerto Ricans been understood as Black because of their relationship with slavery. But now, in the middle of this movement, they sort of threw out there the Hispanic line, hoping that nobody would show up. Yesterday, I spoke at a rally for him and stuff like that. But I've noticed that the crowd yesterday was far smaller than the crowd on Sunday, because they were able to pin him with being possibly a gang member, possibly a bank robber, possibly having a gun, when the question isn't whether he had a gun, the question is why the police had a gun. You know, the question is why the police shot him in the back of the head. I don't know, unless a police bullet can turn a corner, I don't understand how a person can point a gun at the cops and get shot in the back of the head. You know, but like this is central to the question at hand, because the moment you said he's a gang member or a bank robber, then the streets clear out. You know, the moment they said Alton Sterling had some sexual assault charge in his background, the streets, literally the BLM leaders chose to no longer protest for Alton Sterling, right? This is very real, you know. So I mean, this is a contradiction, you know, we have to talk about. And also have to raise the contradiction that we haven't talked enough about the gender question as well. So
let me just jump in. We have a couple of questions we want to get you from folks have put in. But I want to also, I guess, ask a question. It has two parts. Feel free to take either part or neither. One is, you know, I was doing a little reading before seminar, and I was reading that in the war on poverty in Los Angeles, and I believe San Diego as well, only 7% of the funds went to people over the age of 25. So 95% almost of war on poverty spending was directed at youth. You know, we look at how much of a lack of investment has gone into our communities. I think we can see in part the shift that creates a situation in which, as Roberto says, you know, 50% of the Border Patrol are raza, or where, you know, increasing percentages of the police and the military are Black and brown people. So I guess I want to ask in part a question to say, you know, how can we think about a beginning strategy that pushes back on the inclusion of our communities in the security forces, both in terms of our internal policing and our role as an imperial power abroad? You know, can we think of a strategy there? The second question I want to ask is just to get your thoughts, all three of your thoughts. What's happening around the United States? How do you understand this moment in terms of the history you're familiar with of other social? What do you see going on? If somebody were to come to you from Chile or from DF or from France or from Morocco and says, what the hell is going on in the United States? How do we answer that question?
Well, I'll take that second question first, just to get us started, not as a well-formed thought, but just to say that they are coming to us, and you know, a lot of folks know exactly what is happening, and they're finding parallels and building sort of transnational movements, particularly around Black Lives Matter, Las Vidas Negras Importan, you know, what is going on in Brazil and what is going on in the United States with regard to both COVID-19 and the brutality of the state with regard to policing and surveillance. You can see sort of as mirrored, even though the sort of local context might be different in multiple places. There were movements in Europe, in South Africa as well, in Palestine. And so I think what our job is, and when I say our, you know, there are many different of ours that we're speaking across and amongst right now. But I think I'll speak for myself then, and I'll say, you know, what's interesting to me is to be able to focus on sort of the local and at the same time have an internationalist perspective, to be able to make these connections, you know, with regard to Chile, for example. You know, Michelle Bachelet declared certain Mapuche, indigenous people in the south of Chile, fighters who were, you know, engaged in their own sovereign struggles. They were declared terrorists using the language of US sort of imperial foreign policy around the war on terror. I mean, this is a socialist so-called government that's doing so. So I think that there are multiple ways that we need to pick up on the solidarity that's being shown us, and to engage in sort of internationalist as well as local struggles.
Thank you. I think we'll take some, like Danny said, we'll take some questions from the Q&A there. Folks have a lot of good and interesting questions. I think they're recognizing there's a wealth of knowledge here. So Meredith asks, this is for Dr. Harvey. Dr. Harvey is speaking about colonial laws that restricted the movement of indigenous people in colonial Virginia. Can these panelists discuss how policing is to enforce legally mandated racism or not, as the case may be?
Legally mandated racism. Well, I think, you know, there's far little that's not legal about racism these days. So we can think, I mean, I'm not sure that I'm getting at this question, but, you know, I would think about things like, you know, from Plessy versus Ferguson to stop and frisk, right? As really important sort of legal moments that in which policing and surveillance was used, and it continues to be used to sort of maintain racialized spaces, right? That signify how one belongs sort of to the nation, right? And whether one sort of has the right to be present. So I'm not sure if I'm getting at the question. I don't know if folks want to add to that, and maybe I'll come back.
And I may have asked,
people need to fit in, like inclusion.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Harvey, I think I may have asked the wrong question. I see another question on, Meredith had two questions, but I'm not sure. But this one also asks, I'll throw this out there as well, as academic experts who are also people of color, how do you handle criticisms that suggest, as people of color, your objectivity on subjects within your expertise is compromised? And thank you for giving this great webinar. Maybe that's a question too.
I make no pretensions to objectivity. I think it's a false construction to even suggest there's such a thing as objectivity versus, say, presumed bias. I mean, everyone speaks from a very specific place, and we are the only ones that actually acknowledge and make no pretensions otherwise. And it's the false pretension to objectivity of historically white scholars in predominantly white institutions that is really the problem, right? And I think it gets, I mean, if I may for a second, it gets to a broader problem, which is, you know, many from the Mamos in Colombia to many other native peoples here in the U.S. have long spoken about the world is turned on its head. Colonialism is a world turned on its head. It's the world turned upside down. Is what allows for gang members to be seen as bad and cops seen as peace officers, right? It's like we have completely inverted definitions. So when we as POC scholars get these questions around, well, are you just maybe a little bit biased because you're POC? Well, it's like, damn, hell yeah, I'm biased. I mean, you know, who isn't? Like, you know, it's a false sense that one can actually be objective. That is itself part and parcel of this world turned on its head, you know. And then it even gets to the very same questions that Danny asked earlier about, like, why are all these folks of color joining the cops, joining the military? I mean, I think until we provide a different alternative to them, to be able to get them invested in community, invested in, you know, whether as Dr. Odom was talking about the lumpen as people outside the system. I mean, to me, this is where the lessons around, I don't think in terms of states, I'm like not interested in states, but question around autonomy, autonomous communities, and those as alternatives to some of these people that exist relatively, I'll say, outside of the state mechanisms and the policing mechanisms of the state, that until we provide those types of serious, legitimate alternatives, we're going to continue having a lot of, you know, our own folks, if you will, going down these routes. I mean, I am glad you mentioned Leo Ibarra, but also this week we're getting news of Vanessa Guillen, who they're saying they might have found her body's remains and so on. And I've been hella conflicted because on the one hand, she's military. So you know, I don't really want to care, you know, but on the other hand, she's a woman of color. And this is what happens to our folks when they end up, you know, buying into that shit and then end up getting killed by their own supposed, I don't know what you call them, crew members, whatever, you know, they're other military folk. So yeah, I mean, so I often like to invoke this notion of the world is literally turned on its head, to start thinking about how we might, you know, rebalance it in some ways.
Well, I mean, you know, I think that I mean, if we're taking history as precedent, that there have been non-parasitic examples of state formation. So I don't, you know, it's kind of like, okay, that school is like treating people bad, and then someone's like, all right, well, come out here to the woods, we can have a school. Like, no, we can take over that school. You know what I'm saying? So I don't want to give up, just my political person, just like, I don't want to give up on the idea of seizing state power as it works, because the question will always, well, one of the reasons is the people, we got to answer to the people how we're going to stop the pain people feel, right? And that is through self-determination and Black community control, brown community control, and stuff like that. So I think that is essential. And like I said, us having this sort of back and forth, everybody, me and Roberto have this until we're gray in the head and in wheelchairs. So that's fine. But or no hair, right?
I don't know if I'm gonna get it.
He's like, I wish I was gray in the head, but no. but you know, so this is something, but I think that sort of it's a material contradiction, but it's sort of a contradiction that has always existed. I remember whenever the Harriet movie came out, I don't know if it was last fall or earlier this spring, I really don't know, even, are we still in 2020? I don't know, you know, I'm just in this bunker. But I remember the big question was, you know, how come they have a Black slave catcher in the film and stuff like that? I just think this is, you know, just wrong. But, you know, I think Danny's asking us to wrestle with this idea that there were, you know, our own who sided with power, but and it is a material contradiction, but it's also an ideological contradiction as well. It's a political contradiction. But going back to this idea of objectivity, just real quick, you know, Karl Marx created this idea of historical materialism. I think in best way we can highlight what historical materialism is that like class conflict is the engine for change throughout society. I am one who wholeheartedly believes that even the bourgeoisie believe that sort of class conflict is the engine of change. They just want their class to win, right? So this comes back to the point here that, like, you know, this idea of sort of a pretense of objectivity is almost laughable. The question is whether you can disprove what I've told you, right? It's not whether you agree with what I told you, it's whether you can disprove the facts being put forward. And that is the academic, I mean, that is the question. That's also how so many of us exist with oppositional ideas in academia. Just practically, I like to say that I'm not a person who sort of, I think thinking as a materialist, we're thinking about structures of power. So, I mean, you can either agree with that or you could not agree with that, but I'm not a person who makes a person stand up in class and calls that person out because of their position or something like that, you know, the sort of call out culture.
Right.
A lot of people fight or something like that. That's not what I think we're talking about. We're talking about a real material struggle over ideas.
Can I just add
Harvey, did you wanna...
just very quickly, I promise not to go on long. I want to say two things. The first one is just on a personal note. You know, I gave up on objectivity in 1992 when, you know, everybody saw the video of Rodney King getting beat up, and the jury decided that that what we could see with our own eyes didn't really happen, right? So there's a lot of gaslighting that happens with regards to white supremacist, anti-Black heteronormativity. And I think that we just need to call it out, right? That what happens a lot with regards to arguing over, you know, what is true and what isn't, it, you know, happens within the framework of gaslighting. The second thing, though, I will say is, if you are interested, Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, I think in the last chapter on history, has time for a bunch of white historians. And Du Bois is, you know, son of enlightenment, and he believes in objective truth with a capital T. And the way that he writes that chapter, and, you know, which ends up sort of an indictment on white historians in the United States, sort of complete booklet of lies that they tell about Black people during enslavement and after, I think, is a really excellent sort of example to follow if you have time to engage the trolls around objectivity.
Thank you, Dr. Harvey. I did have a question also for you, Dr. Harvey. What are some of the lessons or the takeaways from, you know, what's happening in this current moment, and you know, what's been the role of policing in history? Like, what would you like folks to walk away with, either knowing or understanding about the current moment that we're in?
Well, I guess I would say two things. One is that the health of Black folks is related to policing, right? So if we ask the question of why are there so many people out on the streets in the middle of a global pandemic, we can see the way in which people understand Black life and Black death as an everyday question, whether that be because of anti-Blackness and racism more broadly within the medical industry, within sort of industries of knowledge production, and also surveillance and policing. So I think that a lot of work has been done, but needs to be done in thinking about those two things as connected. You know, of racism, this is Ruthie Gilmore that says, racism is sort of defined by what are the exact terms that she used? Somebody help me here.
Group differentiated vulnerability to premature death.
Premature death. Thank you, Roberto. If I can.
Page 28, Golden Gulag. Yeah.
Thank you. So that's the first one. And the second one I would say, you know, to walk away with is a curiosity and an interest in what abolition is as a movement, right? And, you know, I'll repeat what I heard Angela Davis say on Democracy Now!, you know, a few days ago, which is that abolition isn't about, you know, simply dismantling, but about building up. And what are the sorts of practices and ideas around around justice and accountability that we have been implementing all along, and that we can create as new sort of practices and processes that make it impossible for Blackness to be reduced to, for indigeneity to be reduced to that which must be enslaved or policed or incarcerated.
Thank you.
And we have, I'd like to hear kind of that same question answered from Dr. Roberto and Dr. Odom also. If you could talk a little bit about what what insight can we take from history for the times that we're living in now?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just try to be brief and say that we have to keep the police guessing, right? And what I mean by that is that they're always going to try to be one step ahead through surveillance and otherwise. But from the most simplest things to protest on the streets, just one quick example. I spent many years up in the Bay Area, and I was there during the Oscar Grant uprising, and then months later when Lavelle Mixon happened and people freaked out. But prior to that, during Prop 21, during the organizing around Prop 21, we helped organize walkouts throughout Bay Area schools, 6,000 people that jumped onto the BART, the equivalent of the trolley, from different places, all simultaneously showed up in San Leandro. We went to a juvenile hall. And as we were marching to the juvenile hall, we turned right on this last street to get up to it. And at about 2,000 people, cops start trying to reorganize and go up that other street to keep us contained. But at about 2,000 people, we cut it off and we sent people up the next street. Cops didn't know what the hell was going on. At about another 2,000, cut it off and we send them up the 3rd Street. And so in that sense, even though they're trying to keep us contained and prevent us from getting to the juvenile hall, we managed to outmaneuver the police and show up from 3 blocks simultaneously and completely engulf and surround this juvenile hall. So that's a very practical example, but from the more immediate on the street tactics to thinking in broader, both theoretical and political terms, what then does it mean to keep the police guessing, right? What does it mean to evade the logics under which they want us to or presume us to respond with, right? And so to always keep them guessing. And not be predictable, right? It's creativity ultimately, right? It's when we talk about abolition, it's also building and I was saying earlier, constructing different alternatives. There is definitely a creative element, a creative force to that we need to not lose sight of.
All right, so from the past, Danny has shared me stories about when he went to Ireland, Northern Ireland, I think it was. Chairman O'Malley Yeshtel, I heard him recently talk about when he went to Ireland as well, and said the thing that really struck him was that he saw white people living in the exact same conditions that Black people were living in. Now what some people in academia will say to make that fit into this sort of question of racism is that they were a racialized subject, but even they would say we're the only colonized white people, right, in the world. So I really think that sort of my answer to that is raising the colonial question, right, as the central question to what we deal with and racism. So this will require us to take a step back. I do think, understand things that academia gave up on 30, 40 years ago, such as domestic colonization. I'm not really sure, just because people moved away from that theoretically doesn't mean that it was disproven, right? So domestic colonization, also the relationship between the base and the superstructure, right? With the material political base for what we're existing in being colonialism, and the superstructure for reinforcement of that being racism. But racism alone isn't going to sort of get rid of that colonial relationship. We see this, right? As in, you know, all the Redskins are not going to be the Redskins anymore. Aunt Jemima ain't on no syrup, right? But the colonial question says Aunt Jemima isn't on a syrup, but high fructose corn syrup is.
Right, right.
So that's the colonial question, which is going to really overturn our contradictions. And then lastly is internationalism, right? When we talk about Black Indigenous solidarity, that's internationalism. Black Palestinian solidarity is internationalism. Black white solidarity is internationalism. So it's got to be raising the colonial question, and the result of that is being being internationalist struggle to overturn that contradiction. And it's going to look messy. People ain't going to be perfect. I think this sort of, you know, that's what I really like about what everybody at Pillars always talks about. It's not going to be perfect, right? But I'll tell you this, there's comrades that we struggle with in San Diego for the last 7-8 years. I've struggled with that are better now than they were 7-8 years ago on a lot of these questions that we raise. I do think that the BLM moment or whatever has realized, even within that tendency, the need to move beyond some of the ways in which it was functioning for the last 6 years, which only, you know, dwindled the movement. Where are the leaders now? I mean, I think they're on vacation and working nonprofit jobs and cameos on MSNBC, but it's like the people are still in the streets struggling. So like, what's the rules of engagement? What's the rules of solidarity, the principles of unity through which we can struggle over so that we can create that new world? And in the meanwhile, have political education like this to make people better revolutionaries. So
Well, yeah, well, thank you very much, all of you. Again, this is one of those conversations. This is one of those conversations that I'm, you know, I'm definitely going to be watching again and taking notes. One of the questions we had earlier was, is there a way that we can share some of the resources that were mentioned, some of the books, some of the articles, any kind of websites that that attendees can benefit from? So if you all could reach out and send, you know, whatever you think would be beneficial to put in that Google Doc, we'll be sending out a Google Doc to all of the attendees so that they can look at that. And I believe also we'll be sending out a recording of it, and attendees, it's possible to actually watch it after it's happened. Jean-Louis, are you there? Is that possible? Like, how early can
and Professor Harvey's book, did Professor Harvey say her book was published already?
That was false. I was making a joke about PowerPoints and preparation.
Okay, but yeah, that's what I would say. I mean, you know, also write and publish on your own, you know, and things like that. Publish for the people.
Yeah.
That's important.
So yeah, so yes, everybody, please publish for the people.
We'll get Claiming Our Stories Part 2.
Yeah, there's a lot of different types of announcements we can make, but you know, we don't always have control over starting on time, but we always have some control in ending on time. So I'm trying to wrap it up. I will say that we have a couple more. Our next political education next week is actually going to be a panel of people who have directly been impacted by police violence on the streets. So some of our folks that we know and love are going to be on that. So I highly encourage people to log in and to watch and to learn from, okay, so we have a historical framework. Okay, well, things can't be as bad as they used to be, right? You know, Dr. Sandra and Ebony's question earlier about gang documentation. I mean, if you look at gang injunctions, it's essentially exactly the same thing as kind of the surveillance and police methods that were used before. If you're from a certain neighborhood, you're not allowed to return to it, right? If you happen to be documented and carrying around a passbook, or if you have a record and you have a felony, right? You know, when I first moved to Southeast San Diego, I was pulled over by the police 3 times in 2 weeks. And each time I was asked, are you a fourth waiver? Meaning, have you waived your Fourth Amendment rights because of spending some time in prison? 2, are you a documented gang member? So again, these things are very important in not only recognizing the history of it, but how does that history impact us today? So again, thank you, everybody. Again, I'm in awe of everybody who was on this panel and all of the information and the knowledge and your ability to speak succinctly and to the point, and for us all to benefit. I think we could easily have each of you on here for, you know, an hour and a half, 2 hours on such an important topic, but I really appreciate the way that you addressed it. We had a number of questions from the audience that we weren't able to get to, but hopefully people were, you know, able to still draw some important conclusions. So next week is going to be about people directly impacted. And then the following week, based off this conversation and based off of a few people who had reached out to me earlier, I'm really interested in taking an international look at policing and see what are some of the lessons that we can take from international struggles and also kind of international militarization and policing. So stay tuned for that. So without further ado, thank you, everybody. As you know, it wouldn't be a Pillars Political Education if I didn't make some type of fumble, like run out of the room thinking my screen was off when I had to move my car. So please forgive us for our shortcomings, and thank you for participating. Jean-Louis and Mimi, are you there? Can we see your faces as we all say bye and thank you for our amazing tech folks in the back?
Thank you, Mimi. Thank you, Jean-Louis. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I think we're good to go ahead and log off, and I'll probably stay babbling on for a little while longer, but thanks again, Dr. Harvey, Dr. Hernandez, and Dr. Odom. Y'all are rock.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Can I log on?
No, you have to stay here. Yeah, you can.